Hello, everybody. I'm really grateful to be able to give this talk to you, to a group of people who are already committed to the care of churchyards and burial grounds. And I'm going to be speaking to you about something which some of you may be aware of, but others will have not thought about so much because you have come to Caring for God's Acre with an interest in the natural world and the natural heritage that such sites offer. But of course, the primary purpose of the graveyard is a place to deposit the bodies of the deceased members of that community. And that was the purpose for which it was set up. And that is the purpose which continues to be a major role for many people in the community to this day. These are places of remembrance, and as such, many of them have, from the recent centuries, memorials standing on those graves. And these have created a landscape which is distinctive and culturally important beyond those of the relatives of the deceased. They are a communal heritage asset which has very great significance, both locally, regionally, and also nationally. There are variations across the country in the nature of the monuments, and many are of in particular importance in understanding the ways in which people think about death, think about how they remember their loved ones, and the way in which they wish to present themselves and their families to others who can publicly see these memorials. So they are an underappreciated heritage in this country because we take them for granted. If we look abroad, as we see here with examples at the top from Crete and at the bottom from Denmark, we see that elsewhere in Europe, for example, burial grounds are very different. Even though these are primarily Christian countries, their burial traditions are very different from our own. And in both these cases, though it's not true of all countries in Europe, the burial traditions are ones which are transitory, in the sense that people are only in the ground or in the tomb for a relatively short time, perhaps 40 years or perhaps only 25 years. And then any remains that survive are exhumed and placed in a separate location, and all memorials and other features of the grave are removed, unless further family members are interred as well, which allows the grave to be perpetuated. And we can see at the top there a modern grave replacing one that was not terribly old that has now gone out of use. And in the bottom, it all looks very smart and tidy and neat, and much investment in memorials can be seen, but these are all very recent. And in 20 or 30 years' time, this area will look very different, with a completely different set of memorials and remains beneath in place. So studying the cultural heritage and changes in time and of monuments and their styles and what they say is much more difficult in many parts of Europe. And we are extremely lucky in Britain and Ireland that we can appreciate this, and our graveyards represent our local history. So we shouldn't take this for granted. We should appreciate it and make use of it as best we can. Now, these memorials start often in the late 17th or more often during the 18th century. And some of the earliest are examples that we see here, which are ones which are not marking the burial of a particular person, but rather they're marking a family burial space. And I start my talk with this because the picture on the left is one sent to me from a local group who are recording their burial ground, and they were inquiring about the rather strange inscription as they saw it on the one on the left. At the bottom is an inscription which states who this plot belongs to, but that person is not mentioned in the inscription above. That is to other people, in fact, with a different surname. And they couldn't understand why that should be so. And it's likely that the people at the top are indeed relatives of the person mentioned at the bottom, and that person bought the plot for his family and then either never went into that plot himself or did so, but his name was not inscribed on the stone. You can see there's plenty of room there for more inscriptions which were never added. So this purchase of a plot and marking with a stone is an early feature of memorials. So they're remembering the family as a whole rather than individual people often. And the same is true of the ones on the right, which are both from the 1780s. And these are in Scotland, and they show monuments that were set up when plots were purchased. And the date there is the date of the purchase of the plot, not when anyone in particular died. And then it says who owns the plot, and saying it will be the burying place for people. They may well have gone in there, but that's not what the inscription says. And it doesn't need to say it necessarily for the people who are using that plot. They know it's their family plot, and that is enough for them. And many people from that family may be actually in that plot without a separate stone. So our idea of having a memorial for each person is not always how things worked out in the past. But we do have memorials that cover a lot of people and a lot of individual burials. We find this in some parts of the British Isles, and it's very common in parts of Ireland, that memorials can have lots of people mentioned on them because the plot has a long life. And I'll just show this example from Monaster Boyce, a graveyard worth visiting, partly because it has a round tower and early Christian crosses, and this stone is quite close to one of those crosses. And it shows a list of names and inscriptions. I've marked them on the right in different color lettering, indicating what I call different inscriptional events, different times that someone has come back to the stone and added a new name and date and so on. It's an unusual stone because there is a bit of deleted text. Someone's name and details have been removed. That's very rare, but you can see how there's a whole series of names. And being a Catholic stone, it has Requiescant in Pace Amen near the bottom, which was carved when the first inscription was done. But other people have been packed in above and indeed even below that. And you can see it lasts, this stone, for almost a century in terms of people being added to it. And in Ireland, we have memorials that last much longer even than that. So some memorials can be just for one person or a couple, others can last for generations. Now, when I was thinking about how to give this talk, I thought, well, I could range widely across all sorts of places and all sorts of times and have some highlights from here, there, and all over the place. But that might make you, thinking of your own graveyard, feel somewhat depressed that your graveyard didn't have all these highlights. And so I've decided to have a little look at St Gregory's Minster in Kirkdale in North Yorkshire, a site I've been doing some research on and busy writing a paper about. I gave a lecture to the Friends of St Gregory's last year, and now I'm writing it all up so that they can publish it, so that people can buy it in the church and so on. And this is a very interesting church. It's a Saxon church that then has some very important carved stones that are preserved inside it, and archaeology done around it. Has a very, very famous inscription over the door that names the person who had the inscription done. It has a very early sundial, now protected inside the porch. But I'm not talking about the church. I'm talking about the graveyard. And I'm talking about the graveyard because, although it's quite large, you can see that from this Google image. There's a churchyard here and these extensions, which I'll come on to in a minute. It is in many ways tediously typical. Okay, so it's not, I haven't gone for a highlight place. I've gone for a place that is like many others all over the country. and particularly like ones in this particular part of Yorkshire. And it consists of a number of zones, and many of you may have zones to your graveyards, which consists of an old part, which is marked there in red, and then a series of extensions. So we then go into light blue, dark blue, and then slightly separated, the other side of the car park to get for those attending church is over in that sort of green colour over on the left. And it's in there, in fact, that the archaeologist who has done quite a lot of excavation at this site, but also was one of the instigators of archaeological recording of monuments and encouraged that to take place, and was a mentor to me, Philip Raats, which I think Ian Dormer knew, who's in the audience. He is actually buried there with quite an interesting gravestone, because he knew a lot about gravestones, so he did quite an interesting design for his own stone, which is in that new part. So we'll look at several of these areas and see what's interesting about them. We're not going to just concentrate on the oldest monuments, because one of the things which the graveyard can tell us is changes over time, and as we see here, over space. And we can look at that within one graveyard, or as part of what I'm doing in writing up about this particular site, is looking at it in comparison with the ones in the region and how it is typical or atypical of a wider perspective. And many of you, no doubt, visit a lot of churchyards in your vicinity, and may visit many more when you're on holiday and so on. And it's interesting to have these comparisons. So one of the things we have at Kirkdale, unusually, sometimes there's one of these in a churchyard if there's a major aristocratic family in the area, is a big family plot. In the old churchyard, and to a certain extent in the new areas, there are family plots that will have curbs around them perhaps, and have 1, 2, 3 memorials in them. But these are much larger areas that are set aside for particular families. The one on the bottom left photograph there is from the turquoise one, and the one at the top left there is from the green area, and you can see all the curbed plots, some of them with crosses and so on, and they're all marked off in a separate area with this fence, and you can see how it's planted by a contractor to keep it looking suitably splendid and different, with seasonal bedding plants. So those types of social differentiation and the gradual spread of the graveyard are some of the things which may be represented in some of your burial grounds. Many of you will have this spread over time, these extra ones, which of course were not necessary when there weren't memorials. Everyone could just be buried around the church in this cyclical process. It's only the putting up of the stones that makes people feel these burial spaces are now taken, and that's why we end up having extensions to the burial ground. And so let's have a little look at some of the things that we have at Kirkdale. I need to keep moving here. We have lots of memorials around the country that are early, that have mortality symbols on them: skulls, crossbones, coffin, the dead bell, the hourglass showing time running out. And we just have one of these at Kirkdale, and many areas of the country have none at all, because either gravestones have not become fashionable then in those areas, or they just haven't survived because they've been on stone that is eroded away. And this one is an example where it hasn't eroded away completely, but it's a bit difficult to see what the symbols are apart from the skull. There's certainly crossbones under there. And Oliver mentioned Halloween. Well, and also you must bear in mind, these are not pirates. It's not pirates to have these things on, but quite what the symbols either side are is rather difficult to tell. I think one may be a bell and the other may be a coffin, but it's very difficult to tell from this very eroded stone. And it's the only one that's that early. In many parts of the country, the first memorials you get are with cherubs and that have decoration on, sometimes overlapping with use of mortality symbols like we see here, and carved in many different ways. At Kirkdale, we do not have a single cherub. They have all flown away. No, they were never here. They don't seem to have been into the fashion of cherubs. And in fact, the whole of the area around Kirkdale doesn't really have much of a cherub tradition. We have instead these complex shapes for the early part of the 18th century. That one's probably been reset and it was originally buried up to there. And then we have these headstones, which are rather finely carved. They're as nicely carved as some of the ones on the left, but they only have these complex, sophisticated moldings around the edge of the stone. And here's one with two separate columns of text on the one stone, set in one base together there, as you can see. So different areas will choose different elements of a repertoire that's popular at the time, rather than necessarily representing everything. You in your churchyard can go and see what people were choosing to have at any one time. It wasn't inevitable. And we go from the death's heads with the cherubs to then the cherubs moving on to urns. And bottom left here, we have two rather obese cherubs who are sort of leaning rather sinisterly on an urn in the middle. And the urns are the next thing that we have on the headstones. And urns can be beautifully incised, like this one from the Vale of Belvoir, and they can also be in relief, like we see here. And in Kirkdale, we have these particular ones, some of them with swags, a bit like the swags we see on the bottom left one. And also there's a little popular group of them style in this particular part of Yorkshire, which has these rather strange fan-like shapes either side, almost as if they're wings, which we do sometimes see on the skulls with sort of flying skulls. It's almost as if these are wings, but with a cherub. So we have a regional little style here. And if you're interested in these types of things, you can often identify stones that are clearly carved by the same workshop, if not the same person. Most of the stones of this period aren't signed, but you may well be able to identify local styles which have been done by a particular workshop. And that partly explains why you go 10 miles away and the stones might look quite different, though some of the overarching themes might be there, but represented in a different way. Geology plays a part, but also the workshops and their particular traditions that they develop play their part as well. So in terms of thinking about local cultural identity, linking to craft activity, and the families that are investing in these monuments and making decisions about what they want on their monuments, this is an exciting dynamic which can be explored through the cultural material in your graveyard. And then we get the revival styles. We get the classical styles with the pediments, with the urns, and also with decorative elements like this Greek keystone element running around the edge of the stone. And then we move into more medievalizing ones, and some of you may have read some of the material, mainly about cemeteries, where there was what was called the Battle of the Styles between classical revival, Gothic revival, and Egyptian revival, which was important for the choice of the design of cemetery gates and cemetery chapels. That is the same thing that's going on in terms of chapel building itself. You see chapels that are Gothic, and you see other chapels that are clearly classical revival, and you see some nice Romanesque nonconformist chapels. So those of you in Wales will be well supplied with different styles of chapel architecture, and that is reflected in these monuments. So we get some elements that are from the Romanesque, like the nail heading around these features here in the middle headstone, but also a lot of Gothic features, some of them authentically replicated, many of them imaginatively adapted for the purposes of the creation of new works that are 19th century in ethos, but which have inspiration from what is seen as a securely Christian inspiration, which is why some of the protagonists in these Battle of the Styles disapproved strongly of Egyptian and classical revival monuments, because they thought they were inappropriate in the Christian context of the graveyard or the cemetery. So you can look out for those and how they develop. And my system of classification of these monuments for people doing the recording, so you can accurately record the shape in a sort of numerical form. All these Gothic revival stones, which are these simple shapes, Gothic arch shapes, are all 4,200 shapes with subdivisions depending on other features of the stone. You can see when these start, when they become popular, and when they fade out. And there's a few later ones, as you can see, but most of them are occurring in the late 19th and into the very first part of the 20th century at Kirkdale. If you did a survey of your graveyard, you could see whether that was the same for you. And two particular types are most common at Kirkdale, and I've shown them represented here in two different sorts of graphs. So the one at the top is the absolute numbers, and the one at the bottom is the percentage of these two types out of 100 in the bottom. And you can see that these simple shapes here, the 4,200s in purple, are first. And then from the 1860s, these ones with these cutaway sides, so these two on the side here are ones without the cutaway. The one on this slide here is with the cutaway on the sides. You can see that these are different, and this takes over and is most popular through to the 1920s, when there are still quite a few memorials being erected in Kirkdale every decade using this style. Nearly one a year is going up at that time, and at the peak there are two a year of the Gothic headstones going in. So you can see these are, the graveyard is dynamic. Gradually more and more of these things are appearing. People are deciding, oh, somebody's just put that up to Mrs. So-and-so. Do I want to have another one like that, or do I want to make myself look different? And I'll choose a different stone. So these stones reflect individual decisions, each being made in the light of all the ones earlier in the graph that have already appeared. They don't know what's going to come later, but they do see what's already there, it's visible, and they're making a decision. So we can actually see the decision-making process working out as the graveyard fills up. Then we get, we don't really have Egyptian at Kirkdale, but we have lots of Celtic crosses. Now see we're into the extension parts, and here in one of the family plots, and in lots of different shapes and with various degrees of authenticity in relation to actual Irish or Scottish crosses. The cross form itself comes in many different shapes, and again you can see that that has its own period of popularity, which is in the early part of the 20th century. So the later stones, some people aren't very interested in these. They still have their own character. They still reflect aesthetics of the time that they are being commissioned and erected. And they also carry ideas of how people should refer to each other and how far they should describe death. So by the time you get to these types of stones in the first half and the middle of the 20th century, many more people are falling asleep than are dying, and so on. So there are different ways in which people are recording information on the stones and portraying the people that they are commemorating. And the very fact that many of these look very similar also reflects the way the industry is producing them, but also that the consumers are happy with that form of production and their consumption of it. Occasionally you get individually commissioned memorials at any time, and in fact we get more now than ever. People are aware that you can have a commissioned stone that is different, but we have periods when this conformity is definitely the way people are thinking, and that again says something about society at that time. And sometimes you have regional things even in the 20th century. So here we have the Yorkshire rose being portrayed on stones far more frequently than you would get any of these roses anywhere else. So my father, who is buried in Warwickshire, I'm proud to say I made sure he had Yorkshire roses on his headstone. So he remains a distinct Yorkshireman in this Warwickshire graveyard. So that's a sort of symbol of identity which people are putting on the stones, which is not text, its image. Now, I mentioned about carvers and workshops, and sometimes the style of the monuments does allow you to see these. These are ones in Northern Ireland and just into the Republic. In fact, some of them, they cross the border, and they're what I've called the lozenge nose carver, because he has this rather strange diamond-shaped nose. The carving of the mortality symbols is on one side of the stone, and on the other side of the stone, headstone, is the text. And the puppy skull carver I have is that they're rather strange. You wouldn't necessarily think of those as human skulls if you just saw a little picture of just that little bit of the stone. You didn't know the context. They definitely have ears, and there's no lower jaw, which is why there's a straight line here. That's just the top set of teeth. The bottom set of teeth are missing, whereas these look much, the lozenge nose carver look much more like faces. And you can see they have carved the crossbones differently. The lozenge nose carver has things that look a bit more like hockey sticks, and they're much more realistically carved by the puppy skull. And the way in which the other symbols are done, notably the bell and the hourglass, again, are different by the different carvers. So looking at the lettering, looking at the symbols, looking at the layout on the stone, as well as the shape, can help you identify workshops and carvers and see those potentially across a number of different graveyards in your area and get an idea of that person's sphere of activity. So I'm going to finish briefly with a few pictures looking at a graveyard from a long way away, because I haven't yet done the spatial part for Kirkdale. And this is a graveyard I managed to get hold of some money to go all the way to Australia to record this graveyard, which had been genealogically recorded but not thought of in terms of the monument styles and what that might mean. And this is the oldest surviving European burial ground in mainland Australia, at Parramatta, which is near Sydney. And that's a view from the nearby car park, multi-storey car park, looking into the cemetery, and it belongs to the cathedral. So this is St John's at Parramatta, and that shows the rise and fall of burial within the cemetery. The fall is not because Parramatta was being deserted, it's because lots of other burial grounds took over, both Anglican and nonconformist and Catholic. And so although the population was continuing to rise rapidly, people were having more and more choices about where they could be buried. And in the end, this one was considered full, and only people with a plot, family plot, could have other people inserted into it. And you can see there's paths, there's trees, there's lines of burials, and there's different types of monuments. So those different colours represent the different types of monuments. And we'll just have a little look about what you can do, thinking about the spatial dynamics of this burial ground and how it's developed over time. So I have this picture here, which shows 4 decades, the first 4 decades of its use. So it goes right back to the very earliest times of British settlement in Australia in the 1790s. So this is why it's such an important cemetery to Australians. And it's when burial monuments are often starting to become quite common in many parts of Britain and Ireland as well. So even in the 1790s, all these monuments are going in. There are many other people being buried there without monuments. By the late 1790s, they start having a burial register, and we can see that, and that survives right through the whole of the period we're looking at here. They were already there, and then you can see how the area grows. You can see how more of the burial ground is used in the 1810s, and by the 1820s, the focus has very much moved towards the bottom part of the enclosure, which is marked by the line going around this shape here, this not rectangle, this shape which fits in with the boundaries of the plots for the laying out of the town. And in fact, a lot of the burial down in the very bottom part here is because the ground is rising and people are putting up quite impressive tombs, which they're on this tiered hillside, which means that they're visible to others, whereas the area to the north, the top part of the map, is very flat. And some of the large areas that remain blank, such as in the top right of each of these maps, is probably where all the poorest people, and probably actually a lot of the Catholics, are being buried. So there's probably more zoning by denomination than is visible in the monuments, but reflects the way in which different denominations were treated in this early town in Australia. And some of these monuments are actually from people who went out as convicts and then made it and end up building themselves quite elaborate monuments to themselves before they died. So I'm just going to finish now with just pointing out, if you're interested by any of this and want to see more and learn more, and perhaps think about how you could record your memorials and do some analysis of your burial ground, then I'm extremely grateful to Anne for setting up these pages, well, day page and then links to other pages about recording memorials and understanding them. So this is a wonderful page on the Caring for God's Acre website. It's a new page, so you may not have seen it. So you can all now rush off and look at it. Anne will be able to notice the hit register and see if this has had any effect. But there's a way in which you can actually see the system and how it can be done. And the bottom part of the screen, when you bring it up, will have these different sections that leads you to various documents and forms and so on that you can download, so you can see what is involved in doing the recording, and then how you can analyze that and find some fascinating patterns and not just have ad hoc bits of information about your graveyard. Oliver mentioned about the school working out, how many people died at particular times and so on. This allows you to do that, but it allows you to do a lot of other things as well. So Caring for God's Acre has really embraced the idea of the cultural heritage being part of their remit, our remit. I think it's fantastic.
We have got some questions.
Right.
The first one is from Gina, who says, how common is block booking of certain areas of graveyards for a specific family? She's observed many and wonders how common it is.
Well, it depends whether she means today or in the past. In the past, it seems to have been quite common. In parts of Ireland, it's still very common. But certainly a lot of York Diocese churches, the regulations say that you're not allowed to book. And if you have a booking, it lapses after so long if you haven't managed to fill it. So there's an incentive for you to only book on your last legs. Otherwise, your booking fee is lost and your place is lost. So because they didn't want the place sold off and then not used, because the problem today is that people often have not enough space in their graveyards to bury everybody. So they don't want it filled up with places, with spots that are never actually going to be used. So, so in the past, they are often booked, usually with a way of, you saw that from the very early ones with those headstones in the 18th century that were sort of saying this is the burial place of this family, sometimes called and his posterity, meaning his descendants. And then you get later ones where it's marked with curbs and sometimes with railings, and sometimes those railings survived, but often they were sawn off and taken away during World War II. So, and some churches and cemeteries have buried the curbs or taken them away. So if you have old photographs, old postcards or photographs of your churchyards, you might see a lot more both railings and curbs round plots in the past that have now gone because of the mower. So I hope that answers the question. If not, just come back again.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. The next question was from Andrea, who wants to know the story behind the name removed from the Flanagan stone.
I don't know the reason for the name removed, and as I say, I've only seen about 3 examples. That's a place called Monasterboice in County Louth. It's not, it's a very interesting stone actually. It's clearly a very nationalist stone when it was originally set up. Because it has some very interesting text at the top, which includes in Irish a passage from the Bible. It's in several different languages at the top. So it's a very interesting stone, but the bit that's removed has nothing to do with that. It's much lower down.
Just quickly going back to the one about block booking of certain areas, Gina came back and pointed out that her question was particularly about 18th and 19th century mid Wales, where she's come across a great deal of block booking, whether that's common there.
Right, that would be pre. It would just be moving into the period when there's plots. It may be also when people are worried about space. Some of the ones in Ireland that get very booked up are because people are seeing it filling up and want to make sure they've got a spot before they all get taken. Or it may be that particular areas are seen as desirable. If you do the plot like I did for Parramatta in your own churchyard, you'll see that certain areas are popular at certain times, are ideal, notably on the south near the entrance and at the east end. They're usually where the oldest monuments are. And then people gradually fill up, and often the north side, seen as outside the Devil's Door and all that sort of thing, is the least popular and filled up last, or has few memorials because all the poor people get shoved there and no one's looking at the memorials on that side.
We did have a question about burial on the south side and facing east, so I think you've covered that one. Question here from Robin. In our churchyard, we have about 390 graves marked by gravestones, but we know from the sexton's records of 1820 to 1865 that for every one marked grave, there are about 3 unmarked graves. How common is that at that point when memorials were quite common?
Yes, usually about, well, it varies. I mean, Leicester, they did a study at Leicestershire and they had a very low percentage of the burials marked by memorials, even though the slate headstones ought to survive very well. And then when I did it in Pembrokeshire, I had a much higher percentage of people who were buried recorded on the memorials. So it does vary. Of course, the number of memorials is not the number of dead people. So the memorials themselves, you might have, if you have 300 memorials, you may have 500, 600 burials mentioned. Of course, not everybody who's on a stone and remembered is necessarily buried there. You may have people who are sort of mariners, or you may have people who died in the colonies or whatever. So it's not a simple one-to-one, but generally speaking, for all periods, including today, at least often a third of people, if not many more, have no memorial, and that's still true to today. So there'll be a mismatch there, but there's enough people by the mid-19th century and later that represent sort of working people who are having memorials erected. So it's a much better representation of all social classes than many other sorts of evidence that we have, particularly that's moving beyond sort of official things like the burial register or the census, because these things are involving choices and decisions made by those people. Some of the information that we have about everybody, they weren't given any choices about what they were going to say about themselves. They were just, had the information collected off them.
Anna says that she understands the more heavily draped an urn is, the more the deceased is missed or perceived to be missed. Is that the case?
I've never heard that before, so that may or may not be true. I suspect it's how decadent you want to be. And in some parts of the country, in that case, their sentiment is much different from others, because in some areas you have a very spindly little, almost like a ribbon bit. And then in other places, they're sort of weighed down by great swags of cloth. So I suspect it's a style according to the carver rather than a sort of gradation of loss. But they do tend to be very polite about each other on the gravestones. You don't get many saying, I'm glad they're gone. It's not a common sentiment, however much it may or may not have been felt. So there's a certain amount of formulaic element to the memorials, which reflects social pressures of what is acceptable.
Sue wants to know if there's an accepted reference book of the symbols commonly used.
The best book that's still in print, there's some information on some of the material you can now download. There's the activities for families or whatever it's called on the Care of the Gods paper site, has a sort of has a list of motifs and what one of their meanings. Some of them have many meanings, which is a bit confusing. The best book is still a book that was originally published in 1963 by Frederick Burgess, which is called English Graveyard Memorials, or Churchyard Memorials, sorry. And that was published originally by SPCK, and it's now Lutterworth. And you can get that, you can order that online, and that's been reprinted. So that's available. It hasn't been updated, it's just been reprinted. So it's a 1960s take on memorials. So it's a very, very good book, but it's very much of its time and of a man who had done most of his research on graveyards over the previous 40 years. So it's of a period that, you know, it's not how we would write a book now, but it's an excellent book, and that has quite a bit on the symbols.
Thank you. Trisha's asking a question about the timing of when memorials became common. So our churchyard has a few 18th century stones, but most are 19th and early 20th century, even though the church's history goes back to Norman times. So you could tell us.
Yes, that's right. So most of them are having their burials not marked with permanent markers right up until the late 18th century. In some places, it's the mid 18th century, and a few places, it's the early 18th century. And you get the occasional memorial that's the late 17th century, but they are pretty rare. The earliest ones are in Scotland, in mainland Britain, they're in Scotland in the 1620s, but they're very rare. Now that's partly because they weren't very common, we think, and of course it's partly that that's an extra long period of time for them to survive and be legible. So also a lot of the earliest ones, you couldn't see those governed stones, but in terms of scale, but they are very small, and they're and sometimes they're very sunken into the ground, and one does wonder whether there are more really early ones that have actually got buried. You know, they're just sunk into the ground. In fact, some places, people were so worried about them sinking into the ground, they actually wrote whose memorial it was across the top of the stone, so that as it sunk into the ground, you could still read the name of whose plot it was along the very top of the stone. So obviously that was a common phenomenon. So a lot of places are only late 18th. So Kirkdale has very few, for example, earlier than the late 18th, has a few, but not very many.
We've got a question here from Stefan, who asks when church authorities began to dictate what is and isn't allowed in respect to memorial style, because there's a lot of conflict and potential conflict over that at the moment, isn't there?
There is, yes, and that's partly why you go through a period in parts of the 20th century when the memorials look so similar. It's partly reflecting that sort of authoritarian control, whereas the earlier memorials have more choices and people are making more choices, though it doesn't mean there isn't sort of social pressure to conform or whatever. And you never know whether individual vicars would have made a fuss about anything, but one doesn't get the impression, there's not really much evidence that they did. So it's definitely a 20th century phenomenon, and probably not at the very beginning of the 20th century either. I haven't actually done a study of the sort of graveyard regulations and when they came in. That would be quite interesting to do, and to look at particular dioceses and what rules they brought in when. But it is one of the reasons why you don't get lots of crosses now, is that they're all banned as a form of monument.
There's been a couple of questions about sort of from people whose churchyards have been recorded by family history societies and things like that. What can happen with the information when people have done a monument, a recording of monuments? Where might it go, Howell? Can you tell us a little bit about that particular?
Well, it depends on the family history society and their attitude to their data. So some of them are extremely proprietorial and commercial, and you have to buy it off them. either as a block or per query, and that's their income stream for their organisation. Others put the information up online and it's freely available. So it's very variable by group. Some of them deposit the lists with their local archives office, others don't. So it's extremely variable. And usually there is no mention even of the type of monument, or at best it says it's a headstone or a ledger or something. So there's very rarely any discussion of anything else about the stone. Some of them produce CDs which have photographs of memorials on as well. So Kirkdale has been recorded in terms of its inscriptions by the Rydale Family History Society, and you can buy a CD from them, which has all the memorials texts in, and has a plan, and has a little photograph of most of the stones. So that exists, and this can be something from which a more complex record with more information could be started from that. And I would recommend that you use anything that's already been done. But you may find both that stones have disappeared, or they're more eroded and you can't read as much as when the inscription survey was done, or you may be able to read more, or you may read it as something different, because the lighting conditions, the state of the vegetation, and so on can be different over time. So don't imagine that there's always a degradation. Sometimes old stones appear for reasons that are not always completely clear. Sometimes it's just the clearing of vegetation in the core of the churchyard. Sometimes they just seem to pop up. So they're quite dynamic places, graveyards, for reasons that are not always completely clear. So you can start with the transcriptions that they may have, but don't assume them to be always fully accurate.
That's it for questions. Just one further comment from Stefan, pointing out that Alstonfield in Staffordshire has a stone dated 1518. That seems a very early one.
Yes, that'd be very interesting to have a photograph of that to see what it's like. There are one or two parts of the country where there are some 16th century memorials, and there's quite an interesting debate, which hasn't really gone anywhere because the evidence is so thin, about what happens between the Middle Ages, when there are very few memorials, but a few parts of the country do have smallish memorials that survive in small numbers, that suggest that some places did have stone markers for some burials. And then you have a sort of gap and just the odd monument here and there, and then it picks up. And it's whether various religious changes in the either side of the Reformation led to the removal of memorials because they were having papist texts and iconography on them, or whether the monuments never existed at all. And then when they pick up, when they start to appear again with the sort of Cromwellian period, is there a period when these sorts of things are disapproved of? Because in that puritanical period, the body was seen as a carcass and nothing, and it was all popish to even have a proper funeral and a ceremony. So it really was just body disposal, because the soul had gone and what was left was of no great significance at all. And so marking the grave could be seen as a popish type of activity. So it may be there are a series of phases early on in the post-Reformation period, pre the period we're largely talking about today, which led to purges of monuments, which is why we don't have them surviving now. So that's a debate for us scholars to argue back and forth based on very little evidence. So none of us will ever be disproved. But it is odd that there is this sort of hiatus for quite some time, and with just the odd monument. And is the odd monument because there only ever was an odd monument, or is it because it's all that's left? And I don't have an answer to that, I'm afraid.
Thanks very much, Harold. That's the end of the questions. Just a couple of quick points from me, and then I'll hand back to Oliver to close. First is that Harold is going to do a webinar for us. Thank you very much, Harold. And we don't yet have a date for that, but it will be on the website and on social media and things like that. But if people are already interested in attending, please send us an email or leave a message on our office answer phone. We're not in the office currently, but we do pick up the messages regularly, so we can put you on the list and let you know once we do have a date for that. The other point is that normally at our AGM we do ask people for a small donation towards the cost of running it and things like that. So if anyone feels moved to make a donation, that would be greatly appreciated. And thank you all very much for coming. I'll hand back to Oliver.
Thank you, Harriet. And thank you especially, Harold. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, which we have recorded and will be available, I think, well, Anna will tell us when it's available in due course, but we have recorded it and it will be available once it's been edited and so on. But Harold, I am really, really grateful to you for illuminating our understanding of the heritage of the built heritage of churchyards, and I look forward to all the other work that you're going to be doing with us in the future, particularly the webinar, which I'll be attending definitely. So before we finish, I think if you can unmute your microphones, and we should give Harold an indication of how much we appreciate it. So thank you very much, Harold.
Thank you very much. That's really nice. And if any of you have any other questions, you can find me on the internet and email me to ask me anything. Okay, or if you've got any photos of anything that you need sorting out, then I can do my best for you.
Thank you very much, Harold. And with that, I wanted to say that our online AGM has now moved to close. So thank you very much, and a safe journey back to your homes. This is what I normally say, but safe journey back to your cup of tea or whatever other refreshment you have planned. So thank you very much for attending, and let's hope that next year it will be in person and we'll be able to enjoy your company even more than we have done today. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.